Okay, so here we are finally to the main meat. All the videos before this were kind of setting up the political and situation of what the heck is going on before the actual crusade starts. But now we're gonna be switching, I guess, from the Roman perspective to more the European Western perspective, as now this is finally the part where Pope Urban calls for the crusade. And heck yeah, let's just get to it, guys. I've actually been really excited about this. So yeah, let's get to it, shall we?
So far, we have covered the first crusade of Alexios Komnenos' reign as he usurped the throne of a bankrupted and exhausted Eastern Roman Empire in 1081. He fought off the Normans and Pechenegs and restored imperial authority while maintaining the balance between the powerful noble families, clergy and commoners. And yet the biggest issue on the agenda was left unaddressed. The now firmly established Sultanate of Rum, which began as a branch of the Seljuk Empire, was no longer a vassal of the Byzantines. A year after his victory at the Battle of Livonian, Alexios launched several ambitious social and monetary reforms and crowned his son John as heir, before assembling an army to reconquer Anatolia. But before he could depart, news of a Serbian uprising reached the capital, and the emperor knew that he could not campaign in the east while the west was in open rebellion, so he set out towards Dyrrhachium. As the army moved across the Via Egnatia in 1093, Nikephoros Iachenes, the son of Romanos IV, was caught with a concealed dagger. After being tortured, the co-conspirators were revealed, and to the emperor's surprise, the list included the former empress Maria and his own brother Adrianos, who plotted to kill him. Alexios—
You can't trust anyone when you're in power, guys. That's kind of the sad reality. I mean, granted, obviously you would want to be more noble, especially in the medieval era, than a peasant. But even then, it's like, you have enemies on all sides. Even your own family would kill you for power. You know, we've seen a lot of, in these videos, the political court life, and how even, relatives will just straight up try to murder each other, and it's like, you can't trust it. It's almost lonely, in a sense, right? Like, more lonely than I think anything, because it's like, who do you trust? Like, it's hard to trust people. And my paranoid butt would probably break down if I were in that situation. I'd be like, everyone's my enemy. I'll be like the Mad King for Game of Thrones. Burn them all! Like, you know. Everyone's an enemy to me. Yeah, I feel like how do you not develop just severe paranoia? You know?
Came to the realization that the empire was not stable enough to afford a large-scale, lengthy campaign against the Seljuks, and that with every idle moment, it was slipping back to the disasters he fought so desperately to avoid. Luckily, he was meticulously working on another plan. After witnessing the military prowess of the Norman knights firsthand, Alexios appealed to the courts of the West, hoping to inspire an armed pilgrimage which would reconquer the Roman lands for more than just gold. Agents spread the stories of how the Turks extorted and killed innocent pilgrims on their way to Jerusalem, how the Muslims destroyed holy sites and turned ancient churches into mosques or stables, how Christian men and women were enslaved and violated. Along with these came generous donations of not just coins, but precious artifacts, even pieces of the true cross, giving a taste of what was to come if a group of knights would take up this colossal task and act as a new kind of mercenary force. The Seljuk treatment of the many pilgrims who made their way towards Jerusalem was exaggerated, but not untrue. In contrast to the sedentary Islamic population, the nomads didn't strictly follow the Islamic laws of war, and were known for their brutal punishments and executions. The Seljuk realm was decentralized, and rogue chieftains often enacted their own justice. More importantly, Jerusalem, as well as the entire Seljuk Empire, was in a period of turmoil caused by a succession crisis, with at least 4 pretenders and many other governors fighting each other. The majority of Christian Europe was illiterate and obsessed with holy relics. There were numerous sites that people believed to be sacred, and groups of people were displaying the bones of supposed saints for a few coins. And yet the most holy of sites was that of Jerusalem and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, from which pilgrims would bring back scrapings of rock or dirt as proof of their journey. That very church was destroyed by the Fatimid Caliph in 1009 and rebuilt in 1048 with Byzantine resources. Fear took hold of the populace, who thought the Seljuks would do the same. In fact, many believed that Jesus would return around this time to the place of his birth. Natural occurrences, such as meteor showers and earthquakes at the time, only deepened the fears and hopes of the Christian world. For centuries, the main opposition to Islam came from the borders with that world: Iberia, Sicily, South Italy, and Byzantium. But a new movement was starting to develop within Lorraine, Burgundy, and France, one which called for a completely new type of war, a holy war. Pope Urban II himself cited the Book of Daniel, stating that God had indeed changed the times and offered a new remedy for human sin. The pagans to the north were gone, the Reconquista was yet another source of fear and hope, and the nobles were obsessed with the idea of a just war. The lords who dominated the fractured monarchies grew rich and numerous with the technological and agricultural innovations of the 11th century, and by now, most houses adopted primogeniture, which meant that the older sons inherited the domain, leaving younger sons without a purpose, often turning against each other despite the outcries of the church. Pilgrimage was one of the best ways for the Latins to repent for their sins, whether it was to Santiago de Compostela, Rome, or Jerusalem, as long as they could afford it. They knew the road and how to fight, but lacked a common goal and leader. Until this period, the papacy had little more than nominal power, but the energetic pontificates of Leo IX, Nicholas II, Alexander II, and especially Gregory VII led the Papal States to vie for power and authority over the entire Catholic world. Leo IX personally led an army in 1053, as seen in our series on the Normans in Italy. In 1063, Alexander II sent a papal banner and an indulgence for those who fell in battle against the Muslims to the army preparing for the siege of Barbastro in Spain, and another one to William of Normandy as he was preparing his conquest of England. In 1073, Gregory VII proposed to lead an army to aid Constantinople, and now Urban II, who had just regained the papal seat from the anti-pope in 1093, the year the plot to kill Alexios was thwarted, was preparing to outdo them all. Pope Urban II
there have been videos from like over I think it's overly sarcastic productions about some of the Pope fights and wars, and even videos from like, I think, what was it? What are those guys called? There's a video called Wild Popes in History. Like, the history of just the popes and the lines has its own, like, there have been some wild things that have happened in the papacy, and I think that it could be just as interesting as fun as like the other politics of the world, you know? A lot has happened.
Elected in 1088, and was one of the most prominent supporters of the Gregorian reforms, which outlined the superiority of the church over the secular rulers. Initially, he was isolated from Rome due to his clash with the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, but he was energetic, well-spoken, and extremely charismatic, touring Norman Italy, gathering support everywhere he went. Determined to gain the pontificate, he even reached out to the Eastern Roman Empire, extending the friendly correspondence with Alexios, which was established by the former Pope Victor III. Even after being recognized as the Bishop of Rome in 1093, he continued his frantic expeditions across Christendom and assembled the Council of Piacenza in March of 1095, which was centered around church reform, the anti-pope, heresy, and the issue of the French king Philippe I, who married Bertrade of Montfort despite the fact that they both had spouses of their own, for which he was excommunicated. This council was in direct opposition to the Holy Roman Emperor, who was now fighting a civil war against his wife and son, which further strengthened Urban's claims, At the end of the proceedings, a few Byzantine ambassadors joined the council, and Urban inspired many soldiers to enter Alexios' service in his war against the Turks, and in return, all of their sins would be forgiven. This was only a small preview, during which the Pope tried to see how his audience would respond, before he could proceed with the grand tour of France he planned. The next crucial step was securing the support of two notable figures. The first was Bishop Adhemar, who would become the spiritual leader of the movement, while the second was Count Raymond of Toulouse, who was incredibly wealthy, had already fought Muslims in Iberia, and made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. With their allegiance secured, Urban crossed the Alps in July 1095 and entered France in full regalia, to the cheers of massive crowds who had not seen a pope in half a century. The first place.
Man, like I said, it's cool to just see like a more in-depth look at Urban, because obviously, you know, he's famous for calling the Crusade, but that's kind of like mainly that's the main gist before we jump into the meat of the Crusaders. But the guy's kind of a mastermind in terms of like church and, you know, secular politics, right? And essentially assembling the ultimate Christian coalition. He's basically assembling the Christian Avengers, if you think about it. This is basically, the Crusades are the Christian Avengers, and he's freaking like Nick Fury, essentially. Yeah, overall, just like it's really cool to see, and also just raising the prestige of the papacy, right? As you kind of see in this era, because before the papacy could be kind of influenced or under the thumb of secular empires and powers, but the papacy essentially raises its own prestige and becomes more than, you know, secular rulers or kings and empires, because it's like our authority comes from God, you know. And obviously in this world, the medieval world has a primarily, you know, Christian world, and the common people are, you know, Catholics and, you know, Christians and whatnot, and they obviously care a lot about their state in the afterlife. And I'd imagine this world like was just, you know, more pious and more religious and more concerned about that, you know, and God. So like, yeah, this would go to show just how that could influence just how powerful the church becomes and how influential and prestigious, you know, the Pope becomes even over kings, because people are more worried about their afterlife than the suffering of the current life. You know, the current life will end one of these days when you die, but the afterlife, that's forever, guys. So, again, like, there's a lot of factors I find interesting, you know.
He went to was Clermont, where he held a council on November 17th. For 10 days he discussed clerical matters, but suddenly he asked everyone to step outside the church and addressed over 400 listeners, making arguably the most influential speech in history. We have 6 accounts recounting that proclamation, each of which was written after the capture of Jerusalem and slightly differs from the rest. But here is a part of one of them, written by a man who attended the council. Now that you, O sons of God, have consecrated yourselves to God to maintain peace among yourselves more vigorously, and to uphold the laws of the church faithfully, there is work to do. For you must turn the strength of your sincerity, now that you are aroused by divine correction, to another affair that concerns you and God. Hastening to the way, you must help your brothers living in the Orient, who need your aid, for which they have already cried out many times. For, as most of you have been told, the Turks, a race of Persians, who have penetrated within the boundaries of Romania, even to the Mediterranean, to that point which they call the Arm of St. George, in occupying more and more lands of the Christians, have overcome them, already victims of 7 battles, and have killed and captured them, have overthrown churches, and have laid waste to God's kingdom. If you permit this supinely for very long, God's faithful ones will be still further subjected. Concerning this affair, I, with suppliant prayer, Not I, but the Lord, exhort you, heralds of Christ, to persuade all of whatever class, both knights and footmen, both rich and poor, in numerous edicts, to strive to help expel that wicked race from our Christian lands before it is too late. I speak to those present, I send word to those not here. Moreover, Christ commands it. Remission of sins will be granted for those going thither if they end a shackled life, either on land or in crossing the sea, or in struggling against the heathen. I, being vested with that gift from God, grant this to those who go. Let those who are accustomed to wage private wars wastefully, even against believers, go forth against the infidels in a battle worthy to be undertaken now, and to be finished in victory. Now let those who until recently existed as plunderers be soldiers of Christ. Now let those who formerly contended against brothers and relations rightfully fight barbarians. Now let those who recently were hired for a few pieces of silver win their eternal reward. Let those who wearied themselves to the detriment of body and soul labor for a twofold honor. Nay, more, the sorrowful here will be glad there, the poor here will be rich there, and the enemies of the Lord here will be his friends there. Let no delay postpone the journey of those about to go, but when they have collected the money owed to them and the expenses for the journey, and when winter has ended and spring has come, let them enter the crossroads courageously with the Lord going on before. Contrary to popular belief, there was no overwhelming cheer proclaiming Deus Vult. In fact, the reception was mixed. At the end of his
really eloquently put though, like you have to give it to him. Like I think it was so profound, some people didn't even know how to react, like but you know, like holy crap. Really well put, honestly. Very like, you could see just even just reading that, the charisma. Granted, it's a bit harsh. I know he only used one account. There are several versions that they differ. So who knows exactly verbatim what he said, but like, if that at least gets the spirit of it, you could see how that could like inspire religious fervor, right? And be like, heck yeah, even I want a crusade now. Like, let's go, guys. Pulls out my swords. Like, but I'm joking. But, you know, again, like, that's such an interesting speech.
Speech, Bishop Aldemar stepped forward and was the first to proclaim that he would go on this crusade, sewing a red cross to his shoulder. The outline of this massive project was set, and regardless of which version we interpret, the points Urban was trying to make are clear. Christendom should unite and stop its internal sinful conflicts, and instead direct them against the Muslims, who commit atrocities against the pilgrims, in order to aid the Eastern Roman Empire and liberate the Holy Sepulchre in return for remission of all sins. Pope Urban II had the same goal as Gregory, but was far more diplomatic, as well as being a marketing genius, taking the idea of the pilgrimage, which was already the most popular option the nobility took in order to repent for their sins, and repackaging it with a new purpose, one which would solve domestic disputes, while also boosting the legitimacy of the papacy in both the West and the East.
Again, look at him, like, just the way he managed to assemble Europe for this. Like, how do you not see the papacy's prestige and influence just, like, become, like, ultimate because of this and his work? It really is amazing, right? Just how you see that rise and that transition there of power, you know? Wow.
This armed pilgrimage was open to all, but intentionally directed at the knights of France, and excluded the peasants, women, children, elderly, and clergy unless a special permission was granted.
That ain't gonna stop them though from going. I'm sorry, I'm thinking about the People's Crusade, which is, what, is that gonna be next? Like, that's where things are going kind of inspiring right now, right? And then the People's Crusade happens, and then it's like, oh snap. I'm sorry, I'm still thinking about the People's Crusade telling from extra history, which was so hilarious. So I'm kind of eager to see how Kings and Generals is gonna portray this event, you know?
Notably, simply joining this crusade would not result in remission of all sin, and the Crusaders were required to act appropriately and pay for the expenses of their own journey. Each man who joined had to wear a cross on his shoulder and not take it off until he returned. Anyone who took the cross but failed to fulfill their oath was to be treated as an outlaw, and anyone who touched the property of a crusader in the next 3 years was to be excommunicated. This was to be a massive project, on a scale unseen since the days of the Roman Emperor Trajan, with many logistical difficulties, most of which were to be met by the Eastern Roman Empire. So to tackle it, Urban set the date of August 15th, 1096, the time of the harvest in the region, which meant that the Byzantines would be able to supply the army. Several armies under different leaders were to depart from different locations, so that no region was to be exhausted by the Crusaders, while the whole enterprise was to be under the guidance of Bishop Adhemar.
It's the logistics that's always impressive. We've heard of later Crusaders obviously just preferring, well, you know, their sea, their land routes, etc., etc. But the logistics of having to kind of go through that is kind of amazing. Like I said, this whole operation is the most ambitious crossover in the medieval world. Like I said, I keep calling it the Christian Avengers, because that's essentially what it is. All these different people united for one cause. And, it really is an impressive undertaking. Like, it's like awe-inspiring in a sense, you know?
Many historical narratives begin the story of the First Crusade at the Council of Clermont, but this is not entirely true. The Pope began his grand tour of France, and within the next 13 months, he visited dozens of cities, including Le Puy, Avignon, Lyon, Poitiers, Bordeaux, Toulouse, Carcassonne, and Montpellier, saving the biggest cities for special occasions like Christmas or Easter, while carefully avoiding the Normans of Normandy, who disagreed with him, and the royal domain of the French king, who he excommunicated. With each visit, the crowds grew larger and the outcry louder. As he was traveling, he also wrote letters to lords and clergymen, several of which survived. In them, we already see the euphoria taking over as the general population took this novel idea and ran with it. In his letters, the Pope recognizes that the response was larger than he ever anticipated and desperately attempts to take back control of the situation. To neither clerics nor monks, however, do we concede permission to go without the permission of their bishops or abbots. Let it be the bishop's duty to permit their parishioners to go only with the advice and provision of the clergy. Nor should young married men rashly set out on the journey without the consent of their spouses.
Notice the tone shift now suddenly, because I think he's setting up for the People's Crusade, which, as we know, wasn't the smoothest thing. And it's like, yeah, everything was going pretty great, inspiring, awe-inspiring, but then, like I said, like, there's a sudden tonal shift as, like, this fervor is starting to now go into a frenzy, right? And it's like, even the Pope will start kind of, like, trying to get things more in control, but as we know, the First Crusade definitely was a bit wild. In fact, all Crusades are kind of wild, but yeah.
Another letter sent to Iberia, he writes, "If the knights of other provinces have decided with one mind to go to the aid of the Asian Church and to liberate their brothers from the tyranny of the Saracens, so ought you with one mind and with our encouragement to work with greater endurance to help a church so near you resist the invasion of the Saracens. No one must doubt that if he dies on this expedition for the love of God and his brothers, his sins will surely be forgiven, and he will gain a share of eternal life through the most compassionate mercy of our God. So if any of you has made up his mind to go to Asia, it is here instead that he should try to fulfill his vow, because it is no virtue to rescue Christians from the Saracens in one place, only to expose them to the tyranny and oppression of the Saracens in another." But it was too late. Everyone was consumed by this idea and began selling off everything they owned for the journey ahead.
Yeah, again, like, just the religious fervor. He essentially, it's kind of when you, what's the saying? Like, he about the snowball. Like you do a snowball and then it rolled into a. I forgot the saying, but point is, it's kind of like, you know, kind of spiraling. It's gonna spiral as some people become a bit too zealous. And yeah, the People's Crusade, which I think we'll cover that in the next video, but yeah, overall.
Wild fever ran across France as the prices of grain and livestock plummeted, while bandits stole what they could, taking advantage of the precious moment. Both Alexios and Urban spent years preparing for this very moment, yet no one could anticipate what was about to happen.
Yeah, People's Crusade time, which we will cover tomorrow, so I'll see you guys then, alright? Bye everyone.